we reached a point in the series where I have to talk about Homer and Troy and all that kind of good stuff. Or maybe I get to talk about it, but not entirely sure which one that is. But either way, Homer is always a notorious source. He's very difficult to work with, and as I covered in the past few episodes, it's not entirely clear whether he's, has any validity historically. There's definitely something there, and that's kind of what I want to talk about. But this episode, I'm mostly going to be talking about the archaeology of epic and the way in which archaeologists can use texts, whether they're mythical texts, whether they're political texts, to elucidate and understand what's going on in the record at any given time. Now, of course, our understanding of the Iliad and Odyssey is not complete. The versions and copies that we have are copies of copies of copies of copies, and many sort of individual little areas are missing from Homer's original narrative. So from what we can gather is what I'm going to be basing this on. So as always, I'm going to take my approach from kind of a material culture perspective, but it's always important to point that out. So as always, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.
It wasn't until the late 19th century that the great quest to uncover the physical remains of Troy became a reality. The pioneering excavations by Heinrich Schliemann brought the city onto the archaeological agenda, revealing layers of history and sparking debates that still continue in classical archaeology even today. The allure of Troy as a story extends far beyond its archaeological footprint. It's a testament to the enduring power of storytelling and its capacity to embed itself in the fabric of history. Homer's epics, with their rich tapestry of gods and heroes and monsters, continue to echo through us, inspiring countless generations because of their heart and motifs. And really, at the heart of it, it's just a good story. It's the story. In the words of Aristotle, Homer was the man who taught all of Greece, and to 19th century classicists who believed that Western civilization was the heir of Greek rational thought and philosophy. By extension, Homer was seen as the man who formed the West's central tale. Of all the episodes in this series, I'm most nervous to write this one. Troy really stands as arguably the single most well-known Greek myth. It appears in almost every form of media. And much of the public fascination with the story and the city has grown out of that mass media, and it's not always the best to look at. Take one look at any BBC series on the matter, and romantic recreations are abound. Archaeologically, when we're talking about the real city or event of the Trojan War here, I'm not overly optimistic. Tied up in the narrative are decades of concepts such as Homeric archaeology, which arguably even gave rise to the field of classics as a whole. To really begin addressing this topic, we need to first understand some core themes that have predominated the study of Troy and Homer more generally in historical scholarship. We should first realise that Homer's Troy, as it's outlined in the Iliad, is an idealist narrative. It's not meant to reflect a historical reality. It's a composite epic tale that is based sparingly and episodically on supposedly real events, most likely ones that centred around the ancient city located in present-day Hisarlik in Turkey, known to the Hittites of Anatolia as Wilusha. The site was repeatedly destroyed and rebuilt during its 4,000 years of occupation. And as a result, it is divided into 9 archaeological layers, each of which correspond to a certain city and occupation phase that was built on the ruins of the previous ones in the manner of a tell site, very common in Near Eastern cultures. As is the standard, we can refer to these layers using numerals. Troy 0 is the earliest Neolithic settlement, around 3600 BCE, and Troy 9 is the latest, as far as we know, the version that was occupied by the Romans. I've already mentioned parts of this city back in our episode on the Early Bronze Age. Phase 2 of Troy was active during the Early Bronze Age and served to connect large parts of the early Mediterranean. In fact, it connected Anatolia with all of those land routes that were going into Mesopotamia and the Aegean. As I mentioned in that episode, it really has 2 peaks in its history as a city. For the 200 to 300 years of the Early Bronze Age 2 period, Troy had monumental walls and extensive gold artifacts and served as a major trading hub in the Minoan trade network. It peaked again in importance around 1300 BCE, which corresponds to phase 7a and 7b, around the end of the Late Bronze Age. As well as the site itself, which can tell us about trade links and connections between Anatolia and the Aegean in different periods, its existence and discovery heralds wider themes in archaeology, and how we approach studying the past, and especially our relationship with textual and mythic sources. For one, the real-life existence of Troy is embedded in what's known as a movement called the Search for Homer, which calls into question the extent to which we can tie literary texts to real-life archaeology. This is an enormous debate, and it has implications for the field of history as a whole, not just archaeology, but also especially with how we use Homer as a literal historical source, because that was one of the founding philosophies of the entire field of classics and classical archaeology. The accuracy of Homer compared against archaeological evidence is the archetypal example of how we use texts to reconstruct the past more generally, and is a case study in the pitfalls of why that's a problem. To what extent can Homer's writings tell us genuine things about the Late Bronze Age Mycenaean culture? While we're dealing with classics here, absolutely, the implication has consequences for other fields, especially most prominently things like biblical archaeology. In other words, how much does Homer really tell us about the actual historical 8th century in Greece, or before? And how much is his simple idealism that has no real historical value outside of being a literary piece? Even today, while Phase 7 of Troy does have evidence of burning that people have potentially interpreted as a siege, maybe the one described in the Iliad, there is no definitive archaeological evidence for a Greek attack on the city of Hysalrik. The fundamental challenge with Troy lies with its initial excavator, as most archaeological sites usually do. The site of Hysalrik was excavated by Schliemann and Calvert beginning in 1871. Under the ruins of the classical city, identified as Troy 8, they found the remains of numerous earlier settlements and layers, several of which resembled the Homeric literary depictions of Troy in the Iliad. Upon seeing these and matching the texts to what they were seeing, Schliemann immediately declared that the Iliad and Odyssey were historical texts, and presented the real historical reality, and that his site of Wilusha was the historical Troy. This declaration pushed Homer into the spotlight, no longer as a mythic source, but as a historical one. Schliemann began arguing that Homer could be read as historically accurate, and therefore he used it to reconstruct the rest of Greek history, and as a primary source to find other sites that clearly were historically true. In this light of textual primacy, archaeologists were thought to simply be chasing the texts, trying to prove what was already written first. Following his excavations at Hysalrik, he found new confidence when he went across to Mycenae in 1876, believing the palace there to be the house of Agamemnon. His goal was, of course, to find the grave of Agamemnon, who was the king of Mycenae and the leader of the Greek army in the Iliad. He ended up uncovering the royal cemetery containing 6 shaft graves, which we now know as Grave Circle A, that I mentioned in the previous episode. Among his findings there were a gold death mask that he labelled as the Mask of Agamemnon, even though, as I mentioned before, we now know that it in fact predates the hypothetical events of the Trojan War by nearly 400 years. Not only that, but there is currently no evidence that Agamemnon even existed as a real person, let alone ruled a kingdom from Mycenae. Equally, we have struggled to find historical support for actually many of the major characters in the Homeric narrative. There is no historical record of a Paris, although I will say that Larouche has noted that the Luwian equivalent Parisitis does appear as a Hittite scribe name in a few Anatolian documents associated with the city of Hysalrik. And numerous scholars like Robert Maigret and Peter Jackson have also tried to derive the etymology of Helen from a Proto-Indo-European sun goddess, noting that her name has a connection with the word sun in various Indo-European cultures. In the same light, scholars of comparative religion have noted that her marriage myth may be connected with a broader Indo-European marriage drama related to the sun goddess, and that she is maybe even related to the Divine Twins. So, as we can see, even Homer may be drawing on myths during the performance of his epics over and above historical realities. To understand the full scope of this, we need to look at the nature of epic and oral poetry. And thankfully, a number of important works dealing with the reconstruction and performance of epic were done in the early 20th century, mainly by linguists. One of the most important of these was the work of Milan Parry in the early 1900s. Parry went to the Balkans to study contemporary oral poets in an effort to understand how oral poetry worked, especially focusing on the performance of bards and wanting to look at how exactly they remembered details of their narratives and how they told them. His discoveries were foundational for our understanding of myth and how mythic narratives shape oral culture. He found that oral performance is seldom static. As a performative gesture, bards often move around and change a lot depending on the audience. Orators and bards would often have episodic or linguistic Lego pieces that they could fit together and weave depending on which audience they were speaking to and which themes needed more stress in any given performance. Ultimately, an oral bard would change the story and sequence of events personally when they were telling the story of the epic, depending on the audience they were speaking to, and they would try as well as they could to play into their local mythemes and make their performance more relative, thereby of course earning more money or favour from certain rulers. Naturally, as a bard who is supposed to be telling oral history, some of the more central or known elements would have been harder to modify because they can never affect the core plot. But certain episodes, elaborations, or anecdotes could be added or taken away very liberally. Many of these, such as epithets or characteristics, were often actually mnemonic devices that could help the poet remember certain sequences of events or characteristics of certain figures. And equally, they would paint broader pictures for their audiences. We must remember, first and foremost, that Homer himself was thought, at least if he was a historical person, to be a bard. While of course the reality of Homer as a single person is still in question, my point here is that his works are fundamentally oral poetry. They were performed, they would have been sung, usually to music, hence the Homeric meter. And therefore they act really in the same way. They were likely never one single narrative. There was no one single story of Troy. Instead, we can think of it as collections of anecdotes or episodes that were probably circulating, and Homer codified them together in different performances depending on where and when he was singing. This has wider historical implications, as not all of the episodes could originally even have been referring to the same war, or the same event, or even the same conflict. We very well could be looking at different historical events or even different historical conflicts that have been mixed together depending on different versions of the core story. It's been common for people to argue that the core story of Troy dates back to the Bronze Age. Now, while this isn't out of the question, it's only really half of it. See, the historical events that surround the Trojan War that he discusses in the Iliad may certainly date back to that period, but a lot of work has also been done on tracing the origins and emergence of epic tradition and oral performance back to the Mycenaean culture. In the previous episode, I mentioned the Pylos combat agate, manufactured in Lake Minoan, Crete, and how its motif of battle is found across the Bronze Age Aegean, potentially signalling the development of an early epic tradition even before Homer. Alongside this, we also find the frescoes from Pylos during the late Helladic III period that depict here a lyre player seemingly singing a tale. Some scholars have even argued that the lion hunting motif that was etched on those daggers in Mycenae Grave Circle A constitute a mythic narrative, although this is hard to prove. While the notion that epic and oral poetry was already in circulation during the Bronze Age long before Homer isn't out of the question, to suggest that Homer is in any way a direct continuation of this Bronze Age tradition is hugely speculative at best. The story of the sack of Troy may date the Bronze Age, maybe the late Bronze Age at best, and it may even have been performed in oral poetry during that time. But the tale surrounding it, as Homer has it, would probably be unrecognisable. So again, to what extent can Homer really be relied on for reconstructing a Bronze Age reality? This problem gets even more complicated when you understand our reception of Homer. The versions of the Iliad and the Odyssey that we have today are not necessarily the versions that Homer composed or even had access to when he was being inspired. The versions of Homer that we know right now, if you were to pick up a book on the Iliad and Odyssey in a translation, for example, are in fact 2nd century BC copies, and they date from the Hellenistic period. These copies refer to a version that was likely written down sometime around the late Archaic or early Classical period. In other words, at some point in the early Classical period, authors and philosophers took everything that they had heard or knew about Homer and compiled it into one reworked text. There are therefore numerous issues about how and when our version of Homer was written. We equally don't know the context in which this 4th or 5th century version, or even versions, were composed. To give you an idea of why this is such a challenge, remember the nature of epic poetry. Audiences will adhere to certain episodes or narrative sections that are only really relevant to them, and often gloss over the rest. What was relevant to a 4th or 5th century audience likely was not the same as what was relevant to Homer's contemporary audience. While later audiences may focus on or compile sections relating to elite culture, for example, a 2nd century audience may have been more concerned with political or ethnic identity, and therefore acquire or drop certain episodes. Our version of Homer is the culmination of centuries of reworks and copies that began sometime in the 8th century, but also going through heavy revisions in later periods. So in other words, when you pick up a book, which is a translation of the Iliad and Odyssey, we are not just dealing with a 12th century copy versus an 8th century original, but we are also dealing with redefinitions that happened to that copy during the 2nd and probably even 6th centuries BC, before you get anywhere close to what Homer was actually talking about. Now, thankfully, back in 1991, the work of Professor Susan Sherratt at the University of Sheffield traced Homer's textual references and contributed very heavily to the establishment of a date range for his compositions and performances. Sherratt's work compared Homer's textual references of things like house types, styles of warfare, burial customs, and metal typologies to what we know archaeologically from different periods, all in an effort to date the different episodes that Homer was probably working from. What she found was that we are really looking at a huge mix of periods, where different books, and even probably different stanzas and verses in each of the books, were composed, probably in reference to different conflicts, and probably at different times. To give a few examples here, Homer occasionally mentions boar tusks as elite items that were traded between kings and generals, or in the context of adornments to helmets, which archaeologically we have evidence for from burials in the pre to early palatial period during the 16th century BCE, but no later. Frequently he mentions different shield types, things like the Great Oval Shield or the Bossed Shield, that are made from layers of animal hides and reinforced with metal fittings, along with throwing spears that correspond to what we're seeing in the 12th century post-palatial period, where longer range fighting styles gain prominence. Interestingly, many of the houses that Homer describes are distinctly un-Bronze Age, often having a pitched roof that was typical actually of the early Iron Age architecture during the 8th century when he was writing. More prominently, the use of funeral pyres, like we see that of Patroclus in Book 23, signals the use of cremation as a burial custom, which was very uncommon during the Bronze Age, only really coming into focus during the 10th century. Homer's attitude towards the use of iron also changes throughout the narrative, from intrinsic value item to really utilitarian, signalling that different periods composed probably different episodes, where the metal was more abundant or less abundant depending. So what we're seeing here is a story that has been in the making for centuries, with some of the aspects of the original remaining, sometimes hidden, or buried very deep in one section of the text. But many areas, many episodes in the Iliad and the Odyssey have been changed to fit a later culture. The way in which we can make sense of this is by understanding and dividing Homer's episodes into narrative blocks that are more susceptible to change and less susceptible. Similar to how contemporary oral poets in the Balkans keep elements of that core epic tale and add or remove anecdotes, the core of the story, being the sack of this great city by your ancient ancestors, is of course difficult to change, which naturally includes many of the main characters or arcs, their epithets, and probably formulaic lines as well. Alongside this, key formulaic scenes that serve as kind of mnemonic devices from the poet probably also got preserved fairly well, along with, I would imagine, epilogues or maybe even retrospectives that carried moral or cautionary tales towards the end of certain books. On the other hand, things like individual scenes and episode orders, personal speeches or invocations, incidental details that are describing minor characters, for example, these are the things that are most susceptible to being dropped, or having their context and wording changed with the culture to reflect new values. Homer is fundamentally writing and performing for his own 8th century culture, meaning that key themes and episodes that he will be using most likely reflect the wider geopolitical and social landscape of 8th century Greece, his lifetime. From what we can tell from his writing, the core theme at play for Homer is this notion of Panhellenism, the social action of all the kingdoms coming together to form a new collective Greek identity. And this theme is actually reflected archaeologically in the 8th century, as we see the first traces of the polis appearing and the Aegean collectively emerging from the Greek Dark Ages and becoming interconnected again. His focus on elite culture is also a distinctly 8th century concern, as we see the re-establishment of those strong hierarchies in village sites. Local elites may well have used Homer's performances as ways to re-establish links with older ancestral rulers and legitimize their new authority. Homer therefore tells us much more about what people are interested in the 8th century BC than he does anything in the Bronze Age. So as usual, thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Next week we'll get deeper into classical sources.